The title of my talk, it's really not my fault, it's Kira's fault, all right? is that I guess she read one of my quotes, one of my bad quotes many years ago, and I talked about the forever drought. Now, Reisner's book is an interesting book. And really, Eric gave an excellent introduction, but this is the way I summarize it. Essentially, what Reisner said is that politics and money, not science and common sense, have mostly guided water policy in the American West. And of course, I'm not a politician and I'm not wealthy, and so what I'll talk about is science and common sense. Now, are we in a forever drought? The answer is probably yes, if we stick to the status quo. The way we manage water here in the American West, considering the growth we've had. But I'm optimistic. Californians, really, it's the most innovative place, not only in the United States, in the world. And so we can definitely beat not only this drought, but future droughts. Now, here's a quote. California is still in a drought, and there's no doubt about it. This is a record-breaking drought as far as the modern historical record, as I'll show you briefly here. Now, what is a drought? I looked up the definition of drought, and I found about 250 definitions. Everybody has a different idea. In its simplest, it's less than normal rain. Scientists have a way, and I'll talk about that too, of defining drought, all right? It's often talked about, and of course this is a great agricultural state, when there's not enough water to sustain the agricultural output of a region, all right? But at its simplest, it's really the unsustainable use of our water supplies, which is really the topic of my talk this morning. The other thing to remember, not only in California and the American West, which is really semi-arid, but droughts occur normally in just about every climatic zone, whether it be wet or dry. Now, the history of the American West, when we look back in proxy climate records, essentially the history of the West and the history of California is really written in great droughts. But I tried to summarize it here, is that we all know that when we read Jared Diamond's books, is that water really controls society. The rise and fall of all great civilizations, really the foundation was on the availability of water. But the important thing is that we have the ability not to be the slave to that, but we govern that water. Now, let's talk about what's been happening recently. We're in a super drought here. It has been painful, all right? We felt it not only here in California, but really over the entire West. And then, last winter we expected the great Godzilla El Nino. I put my foot in my mouth and called it the Godzilla El Nino, all right? But what we really got here in Southern California was more like a gecko El Nino. It was a little disappointing. And often after an El Nino, where the tropical waters are very warm, it's followed by a resurgence in the trade winds, and the tropics get very cool. And we get what's called the dry sibling of El Nino, which is called La Nina. But like last winter, right now we've canceled that La Nina watch. So the La Nina has not shown up. And somebody can ask me later about what the implications of that might be. So all I can say is that we've really had weather whiplash here with all kinds of surprises over the last 5 years. Now, if you look at the rainfall for Los Angeles here over the last 5 years, what I've done is I've taken the 5 driest consecutive years for different periods. And you can see from 2011 to 2016, the total rainfall in LA has only been 38 inches right here. And of course, normal would be about 75 inches. So for 5 consecutive years, we've had about 50% of our normal rainfall. Pretty painful. And then there are other periods here. There's the periods, the 1950s and 1960s, which was another famous drought period. And then at the end of the 19th century, we had another drought. But you see, we have these but this one is record-breaking. So the drought continues. In the driest 5 years in the historical record, which goes back to the 1870s. So that's a record. That's definitely a record. But, you know, this drought really began, those of you that are in the water business, you all know that this drought really began 16 years ago. Now here's Lake Mead with the ring around Lake Mead. The top of the ring. Anybody know what year that was? The top of the ring? 1983. All right, and you see it here, 1983. The top of the ring. All right, and again in 1998. That's where, you know, they were worried that the Glen Canyon Dam would actually collapse. That was a close one. But, so essentially we've had a drop in the level of Lake Mead for 16 continuous years, more or less. And right now we're at a level that, this is a critical level. This is as low as it's been here for the last year or so, on and off, since we began filling Lake Mead. So it's only at 1074, which means that the lake is only 37% full. So that's a record, all right? And in some ways, essentially, Lake Mead is my gauge for drought in the American West. Because as the Colorado watershed goes, so goes most of the West with regards to rainfall and water availability. Now, here's the rainfall record for downtown LA. You know, I love data. You can see this is the last 70 years. Now notice that from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, we tended to have less than normal rainfall. So that was a 30-year period. And rather than the average of 15, it was about 13 inches. And then in the 80s and the 90s, that was sweet for water managers. We tended to have a lot of El Niños, a lot of above average years, and the average was about 17 inches. And since the last big El Nino, we're back to 12.5 inches since the last 16 years. So droughts are long. They're not 4 or 5 years. In California, they tend to be decadal, 10, 20, 30 years, or even longer. All right. So droughts are long. And then, you know, I love Jerry Brown. I voted for Jerry Brown 4 times, you know. What a great guy, you know. And, you know, Jerry Brown, the first time I voted for him, we were deep in a drought. You can see that was 1975. We'd had a lot of dry years there. And so Jerry Brown's unlucky. He keeps getting elected into droughts. But then all of a sudden, 1978, it started raining like crazy in California. And so Jerry Brown was elected the second time. He was out of the drought. All right, I voted for him the second time. And then, of course, in 2010, I voted for him again. All right, and sure enough, the third time he was elected into a drought. But this time, the drought hasn't busted. All right, and so the issue here with these droughts, I tend to blame Jerry Brown, you know. Every time he gets elected, we're in a drought. So the question is, has Jerry Brown's luck run out, or are we actually going to get out of this drought? That's a joke, everybody. Now, this is the U.S. Drought Monitor. This is what scientists do. They measure various parameters across the country, and they try to designate which areas are in exceptional drought, extreme drought. And this was a year ago. You notice This was 2015. And the drought in the American West, of course, was severe in California and Nevada, but it was also in Oregon, it was in Washington, it was even in northern Mexico, and the west coast of Canada was also into a drought. You notice Texas was in an extreme drought. Their droughts are a little different than ours, all right? So, not only are droughts long, droughts are large. They're large. It's not just us, all right? And we saw that by Lake Mead. Now, what does the drought look like in time? So I took this same data for the drought, and I plotted it in time. The darker colors are more extreme drought. So what does this look like since the last big El Nino? Well, we started out with 5 dry years. Then we had a wet year, remember? 2004, 2005. And then we started with 4 more dry years. And then 2010, we got a little relief. And since then, it's been 5 dry years. But you noticed, it starts dry, it gets drier, and right now it's driest. So these droughts wax and wane, but the longer they go, the more painful they get. Now, one of the great myths, we had to deal with that this winter, is that everybody loves El Nino in Southern California, except the emergency people that have to deal with the mudslides and the flooding. But the great myth is that El Nino is going to be a drought buster. But not all El Ninos are wet, and they actually happen quite infrequently, wet El Ninos. So you only get really wet El Ninos about once in a decade, all right? So when you do the sums of California's water supply, El Ninos, it turns out, supply only 7% of our water supply, all right? So El Ninos are never going to be drought busters, all right? They are not the great wet hope, all right? So, like I said, El Ninos, they only average big wet ones about once every 10 years. Our real supply of water really comes from what we call atmospheric rivers or a series of storms out of the North Pacific. They really supply about 80 to 90% of our water supplies. All right, now here's the record all over again. Same record, 70 years, all right? And you notice the big El Ninos of 82, 83, 97, 98. And, you know, they can double our rainfall. So they can be over 30 inches of rain in a rain year. But like last winter, we only had 9.6 inches of rain downtown LA. So as I mentioned earlier, they're not always wet El Ninos regionally. So this one was pretty disappointing. Now, it's interesting to note that the 2 driest years in the historical record going back to the 1870s, that was the water year of 01, 02, and 06, 07. Those were really dry, all right? So not only has this drought been dry for the last 5 years, we've had the 2 driest years in history since modern recording. Now, look at the chart there. You notice that 15 is average. Now, are there more years below average or above average? Come on, shout it out. Below. Okay, good. Good students. All right? All right, normally, 7 out of 10 years in Los Angeles are drier than average. 7 out of 10. So whenever somebody asks me to make a long-range forecast for the coming winter, what do I always say? Yeah, you can always tell them it's going to be dry next year, right? So your chances are, 70. You wish you had those odds in Vegas, all right? All right. So the important thing to remember when you talk about rainfall in California, normal is not average, all right? In actual fact, there are very few average years. So the rainfall distribution is bimodal, and it's mostly dry. Now this is what happened last winter. All right, this looks kind of busy, but it's actually pretty simple. What I did was I plotted for the rain year, which I count from July 1st to the end of June. Now notice that this is the average rain year. Remember, that's the one that doesn't happen. All right. And then the blue or the purple and the green, those were 97, 98, 82, 83. And so you see what happened here. In 82, 83, we had a big January, February, a huge March. And then, of course, the spectacular one here in 97, 98, we had a monster February. So that's what rainfall looked like during the big El Niños. So it was really only a couple of months of heavy rainfall and really about 7 to 9 big storms. So remember, this is not Seattle where it drizzles every day and you slowly add up the rainfall over the year. A wet year, all that means is 5 to 7 or 8 big storms. And of course, here was the disappointing part. All right, looked promising in September. This was last winter. But after that, it was all below normal. So that was quite disappointing. All right. So again, I love that word normal. This was not a normal El Nino. All right. This was a puny El Nino. All right. Now, let's look at the Drought Monitor again. This is where we were after the winter. So this is May 2016. What did the drought look like in the American West after last winter? Well, a lot of storms went into Washington and Oregon. Essentially, they got all our rain. Washington and Oregon stole all of California's rain. Northern California got a little rain. And so how did El Nino perform? Well, the Pacific Northwest, they got out of their drought. So for them, it was a Godzilla. My forecast was good. Now in Texas, it started raining last spring, and essentially it hasn't stopped yet, all right? It rained continuously in Texas, all right, for many, many months now, and of course along the Gulf Coast, and the flooding was. But for us here in California, except for Northern California, who got some relief, essentially this El Nino was a gecko. So, you know, it dissed Southern California. But this El Nino was huge. This was the earliest, longest lasting, largest, most intense El Nino in my career. And so when you look across the planet, this El Nino was punishing. Droughts in Asia and Africa, flooding in South America. So this thing was huge, this El Nino, but not for us. Now here's a little cartoon that I found from the LA Times. This is 1933, all right? This is the perils of being a weatherman, all right? And that's Lady LA chastising the weatherman. And so what I learned from all this last winter, of course, is that forecasting El Nino rains for Southern California is definitely not for wimps, all right? And so I apologize for my bad forecast. Now, let's get into looking into the future. California droughts are really joint ventures, I think of them. You know, what causes California droughts? Well, part is Mother Nature, and a large part of droughts today is just human behavior. It's us. Now, here's a shot I took from Mount Wilson. The top one I took in 1902 with my Brownie camera. All right. And then I went back with my iPhone 6S and took another one. And what you can see here is that there has been tremendous growth in Southern California. You know, throughout the 20th century, just in the last 50 years, the population of Southern California, actually all of California, has quadrupled. In the 1950, the total population of the state was only 10 million. We're closing in on 40 million right now. And so that creates a tremendous thirst, not only for urban areas, but for industrial areas and everybody. So it's us to a large extent, all right? In a semi-arid region, we're not a desert, we're a semi-arid region, growth creates drought. And of course, we tried to keep up with that with all the tremendous infrastructure that we've built, going back to the Colorado Aqueduct, the Los Angeles Aqueduct, California Water Project. And in actual fact, we've done a pretty good job. Right? Now, who uses all that water that we move all around the state of California? Well, I tried to simplify it here, is that, you know, part of it goes to the environment. The EPA has mandated it. Agriculture and ranchers use a big chunk of the water. And then urban users and industry use. So if you take the environmental water, which is mandated by law, that's about 25%. All right. Well, what's the net? All right. So the net is that if you calculate it this way, is that agriculture and ranchers essentially get 80% of the water. Urban users and industry get about 20%. Now I'm going to try to convince you that these numbers are wrong. So in actual fact, agriculture gets about 90% of the water, maybe 95, all right? And we get about 10%. See if I can convince you of that, all right? So what's the 800-pound gorilla in the water business here in California? Agriculture and ranching, there's no doubt about it, are California's 800-pound gorillas, all right? They use about 90% of the available water. But it's interesting, you know, if you put all the gross state product of agriculture and ranching, it's about $50 billion a year, which is a lot of money, all right? That's a lot of money. And agriculture and ranching do about 13% of agriculture in the United States. So it's not 20%, it's not 50%, it's 13%. All right? Now, California's total economy is about $2.5 trillion. So that means that agriculture is actually 2% of the state's economy, if you calculate it that way. All right? All right. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we only get 10%. The industrial and urban users. Now I'm going to ask everybody if we think that's fair, all right? Now, here's a little science for you, is that the thing that has really sustained agriculture and water in the state of California are the great deep aquifers in the Central Valley. This is very old water. You can see here that essentially here in the Central Valley, we've been pumping water out of the Central Valley. Let's get right down to it. Since the beginning of the 20th century, what's really sustained agriculture here are pumping deep aquifers. Only used to be about 200 feet. Now some of those wells are over 1,000 feet. So you can actually measure or estimate how much water is being overpumped. In other words, some water gets back in, but most of the water is going out. So going back here in 1962, this is essentially over the last 50 years, this is millions of acre feet. So the average has been about 2 million acre feet per year for the last 50 years that we've overpumped out of those aquifers. That's a lot of water. And so, of course, they're getting lower and lower, all right? And you see, sometimes they do get pumped up a little bit. Notice that the 82, 83, 97 El Nino, there was actually a reversal. So an El Nino can temporarily change all that, all right? So that water essentially was put there when the great ice sheets retreated northward. And they left great gravel deposits, for instance, all over the Los Angeles basin. Not as far as San Diego, and essentially all over the Central Valley. And so that's old water. That water is 10 to 20,000 years old, all right? And right now it's being pumped by, I estimate, there's about 100,000 wells, unregulated and unmetered, most of them, pumping water out of that great aquifer. And remember, without that, there wouldn't have been a state of California, and there certainly wouldn't have been a great agricultural industry like we see today. Now, there's a great myth about those aquifers, all right? Is that water is infinite. There's no bottom to the aquifer. But we know that's not true, because an awful lot of wells in the Central Valley are already sucking air, all right? And as we look ahead, at the rate we're pumping water out of those aquifers, it's going to be like, you know, when you get to the bottom of the milkshake from In-N-Out Burger, all of a sudden you're going to hear a big slurping sound, all right? And when that happens, you are in the forever drought, all right? So, for instance, over the last 5 years in this record-breaking drought, we've estimated from satellite data at NASA that essentially in the Central Valley, that's a big number. Essentially, we're overdrafting those deep aquifers by 8 million acre feet per year. 8 million acre feet per year. Now, how much is 8 million acre feet? That's about the total amount that all the municipal water districts in the state of California use every year. That's a lot of water, all right? So that's a record, all right? Now, here's the California state flag. And of course, it's ironic that the California state flag has the California grizzly, which is now extinct. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about water, all right, now that he's extinct. Now, the thing is that nobody's too happy about water. The farmers are not happy. The cities are not happy. The ranchers, the fishermen, the environmentalists, all right? Everybody thinks everybody else is taking everybody's water, all right? So that means, what's the best profession in the state of California, all right? All right? So, you know, if your kids are undecided about what to study in college, you know, tell them to study water law or be air conditioning technicians. Those are guaranteed jobs, all right? All right, so what are the big drivers here? Long term. You know, we have a roller coaster. We have dry decades, wet decades, right? We've always had that. And then there's the question of, I'm going to bring this up, the fair allocation of water, because there is a lot of water in the state of California, and there's a lot of infrastructure. But the question is, whose water is it? What's the fair allocation? And then the other driver, of course, will be growth and economic expansion. You know, California is the 6th largest economy in the world, all by itself. It has a bigger economy than Russia or France, all right? And it's going to continue to expand, all right? Now, and of course, a big issue is, you know, can we save the environment and sustain a human civilization here? And it's always contentious. It's a big issue. And of course, the biggie here, all right, and this is not the 800-pound gorilla, this is the 1,000-pound gorilla, and that's climate change. And there are sort of stressors here about how we manage water. I'm sort of jumping around here randomly because I don't have that much time. You know, there's the issue of imported water. You know, some counties in California, like San Diego, import 95% of their water. Depending on what's available, we import about 50% here in Southern California, in LA, all right? Now, the problem with imported water is short term. In other words, let's look at Lake Mead today, all right? There's a problem there, all right? Because it waxes and wanes. It's not that dependable, all right? And not only that, I'm going to show you that that supply is shrinking from Northern California and from the Colorado. And then, of course, the another 1,000-pound gorilla, is the aquifer water. It's shared somewhat. It's sold, it's traded, all right? And the other thing that's important about it, like imported water, it's shrinking. It's definitely shrinking, all right? And then, to stick with my random theme here, is that, California is not only a big agricultural state, it's a big oil state. Some of the biggest oil booms in the United States happened here in California. And there's a tremendous amount of oil exploration and oil pumping, all right? So can fracking and clean water basins coexist? Because almost everybody that's a water manager here has some kind of oil or gas beneath their groundwater basins. And so the issue is that, everybody likes the oil revenues and taxes, but can you clean up your water basin and frack and drill at the same time? For instance, Los Angeles County, where we are today, it's the largest urban oil field in the world, all right? For instance, it produces literally millions of barrels of oil every year, and it has for almost a century, since the 20s and 30s, all right? There's actually almost 4,000 operating wells in LA County. So everybody in LA County, 1 out of 3 people live within 1 mile of an oil well. There's a statistic for you, all right? All right, so what are the solutions here? Now, I'm a big proponent of a water efficiency revolution. Some countries that have a similar climate to us, Australia, Israel, they've already engaged and made water efficiency a major industry. So for California, the drought that we're in today, the drought we'll be in the next decade and thereafter, this is a tremendous business opportunity. California is the most innovative place in the world. And so we should be the world leaders in water efficiency. Now, of course, we got a big thing we have to do here, as I mentioned earlier, is groundwater. Everybody would agree we have to clean up the groundwater basins, all right? And store and use them more efficiently. In the good years, we have to store water, and we use that water because we do have a lot of groundwater basins all over Southern California. We're rich, except for San Diego, all right? And then this is a vague one. How can we fairly manage and allocate water, given that the farmers are using 90 to 95% of the water? Okay, I'm getting the hook, all right? And then there's pricing water. And then, of course, this is the 2,000-pound gorilla. Can we revisit the water laws and make them more equitable in the state of California? There's very few places in the world where you have eminent domain and 2% of the state's economy controls 95% of the water. It's just not fair. Okay, as I mentioned here, we all can do a lot better in conservation and agriculture. For instance, agriculture, if they had been more efficient by 10% in the last 5 years, we wouldn't have had to ration water in Southern California. We wouldn't have had to do that 25 to 30%. Just if agriculture had been 10% more efficient, all right? Wastewater recycling, Orange County is doing a tremendous job. Stormwater recapture, we can do better. Desal, all right? Now, we do a lot of desal anyhow because a lot of water that we get out of the ground and from the Colorado, and so we're already heavy into desal. But ocean water desal, we have to definitely look at that seriously, all right? Now, who are the champs and the chumps, okay, in Southern California? Now, basically, I'm going to give everybody a B minus, all right? The Met has done, a tremendous job, but frankly, I can give you a long list of things they could do better. I live in the San Gabriel Valley. We're doing a great job in cleaning up the groundwater basins, all right? California, Water Resource Control Board, they're under a lot of pressure, all right? Felicia is really under a lot of pressure, and they do a pretty good job, all right? But they could do better. Now, the water pricing, that's another issue. But the big one is the California legislature. Now, there has been a revolution. You know, recently there's been a lot of fairly progressive legislation with regard to climate change, air quality, and I think Jerry Brown and a lot of people in the state legislature want to do the right thing. But that's going to be the key, all right? Now, where are we right now? This is where we were a year ago on your left. This is where we are today. Looks a little better. Notice that the Pacific Northwest is back in a drought, all right? We're not out of the drought. Should we continue to conserve? Absolutely, all right? Here's the present drivers of the drought, all right? Go through it. Notice, I'm going to go quickly here. Global warming, I have at number 5. Now, here's California winter temperatures for the last century. Notice there's a trend. California is warming in the wintertime. The snowpack comes later, it leaves earlier. There's less of it, all right? And that's a 2.5 degree increase in the last century, all right? Also notice that the drought has been exceptionally hot this year. Look at that big spike here in 2014-15, all right? So this drought has not only been long, it's been extremely hot, all right? So here's my bottom line here. This is the global temperature going back to the 1880s. Notice that this year, for the last 14 months, it set a record every month in terms of global temperature. So that change in temperature is about 1.3 degrees Celsius, which is your 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, now looking to the future, what's going to drive California water? The number one thing will be in 2050 and 2100 will be global warming. And ag and aquifer depletion will be number 2. Notice El Nino's number 5. So if we ignore global warming, which of these packages won't break? All right? So global warming is the real deal, all right? It's not an opinion. It's not a rumor. It's not a liberal conspiracy. It's what's called a scientific fact, all right? So get over it. It's real, factor it in, all right? Okay, so what we need here is water leadership, all right? Now, it's important that, we use low-flow toilets, lose your lawn, shower together, drive a Prius. But what really counts is how you vote. This is America. If you want to change law, if you want to change policy, it's done in the legislature, at the local level, all right, at the state level, at the national level. So if you want to get ready for a reallocation, a more fair reallocation of water in the state of California, and deal with global warming, which is definitely the real deal, what really counts here is how you vote. Thanks a lot.